Thank you very much, Martin. And I also want to thank Richard and Susan Andrew as well, because I came over here and offered to give a talk, and you very kindly accepted this suggestion. And it's a real pleasure and honor for me to speak to the Oxford Centre for Muslim Christian Studies. Yes, as I say, apart from my academic interests, I'm also a teacher, so I'm quite used to telling stories. And I'm going to tell a story as I understand it. I'm going to talk in quite general terms and give a general picture, try to paint a picture. But I also think that this story from Christian Arab literature can be used as a metaphor also for the topic of Muslim Christian studies, and I'll try to explain that later. So Arabic, as you know, became the lingua franca of the Middle East and North Africa soon after the conquering Arab tribes had established their rule. And a good date to remember for the conquest is 636, that's the Battle of Yarmouk and the defeat of the Byzantines. So the Christians of the region, whether they were from communities which looked to Constantinople in places like Damascus, or whether they were from the, in fact, much more numerous communities which were in time and with the evolution of these churches to become the Syrian Orthodox, the so-called Jacobite Church, or the Coptic Church, by now numerically by far the largest, or the Church of the East, the so-called Nestorian Church. Anyway, all these people, all these communities were in a new situation, and I want to emphasize the novelty of the situation. The Arab rulers were of a religion that had a rejection of the main tenets of Christianity enshrined in the Holy Book. And here you can see a beautiful picture of the Dome of the Rock, so a very early Islamic building. And you can see there also the anti-Trinitarian inscriptions on the Dome of the Rock. Secondly, the Quran is the main reference point for Arabic and Arabic grammar, Arabic style to an extent, and the language was thus shaped, the whole of the Arabic language, shaped around the ruling creed to an unusual extent. So I think it's not surprising that the first reaction that we find in Christian writings from the period is apocalyptic. The general tone is apocalyptic. And it presented a translation issue. Translation literally bringing over, translating their religion into the new world. And so some questions arise. You know, how long did it take them to start to use Arabic? And when they did enter into the new language and the new culture, very much shaped around the ruling religion. What was the character of the writings that they produced? What was the character of the thought in these Christian Arabic communities? Was it surprisingly different in its expression of the faith? I believe it was. So just briefly to turn to my title, the Greco-Arabic translation movement in Baghdad, as a kind of warning, I'm going to go more widely in this story than the title suggests. And as you can see, I'm not starting in Baghdad. More importantly, I've decided to take the fate of one book. There's the saying, habunt libelli sua fata. Each book has its own fate. And we're going to look through history at a particular book, and that is this book. It's a book by Nemesius, and it's called Periphyseos Anthropo, which is On the Nature of Man. And this in fact, was a key book of its time. It was written towards the end of the 4th century, and it was very much part of the whole, what I regard as an extremely important movement historically to reconcile Christianity with science. We have writers like, well, later on, John of Damascus, Maximus Confessor, also Gregory of Nyssa, very interested in philosophy. And Gregory of Nyssa would be a contemporary of Nemesius and also from Cappadocia. So these were people who, in the wake of Constantine's revolution, bringing Christianity and a Christian empire for the first time in history, they were elevating the tone of Christian literature to that of the high achievements of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. And here is Cappadocia, nice tourist picture. And there is also Gregory Nazianzen from a fresco in Cappadocia, not contemporary with Nemesius, but Gregory Nazianzen wrote to Nemesius, I'm assuming that it's the same Nemesius, 4 letters which survive. And Nemesius was the governor of Cappadocia at the time, so around 383 AD. He was governor of Cappadocia. He was a gentleman. He had an education. He was interested in Christianity. Gregory also wrote an encomium, a poem, to him. It seems that Nemesius became a Christian, and he was quite rapidly promoted to being bishop, and he became Bishop of Emesa, which nowadays is Homs in Syria. Initially, and I have a theory on why, his book was not well known. He wrote a book reconciling science and religion. It's basically a treatise on anthropology and very much taking the physical human body as its centerpiece. But around that centerpiece, at the beginning, he talks about the soul, so a universally important question, not only to Christians, to any monotheists as well. So Muslims would also potentially benefit. And also another key question at the end, which is to do with man's agency and free will. However, in the 7th century, his book was discovered by the Church Fathers and used extensively. That's to say, John of Damascus, here's a picture of him, quotes extensively from Nemesius. Doesn't name him, but he quotes from him extensively, particularly in his exposition of the faith. And Maximus Confessor quotes from him, again, anonymously, and other writers as well. So in the 7th century, just at the turning point when the new situation is emerging, we have a great deal of interest in Nemesius and many quotes from Nemesius. We should remember that John of Damascus, who's from the Greek point of view, the last of the Church Fathers, is from maybe a Christian Arabic point of view, the first writer. His name was Yohanna ibn Mansur ibn Sarjun. He is the first writer who is writing in a Muslim context and very much shaped. So someone like Sidney Griffiths would argue by his experience in the Muslim world. So we're talking here about the earliest Christian Arabic literature, however, and that is to be found in the context of John of Damascus. That's to say, the southern Palestinian monasteries, and also Sinai, which is closely related, tied into the St. Sabas, St. Cariton, and other such monasteries near Jerusalem. So even after the Arab conquests, these monasteries in Palestine and Sinai continued to be extremely active, very much involved, tied in also with the Orthodox world, and strongly influential, in fact, upon the development of the liturgy in the Orthodox world. Even today, the Orthodox liturgy has monastic elements from that time. But there were important writers, also Anastasius of Sinai and others, writing at this time after the Arab conquests. And the primary motivation for them writing in Arabic and translating into Arabic shouldn't surprise us. It's extremely practical. New monks are flocking to these monasteries, and many of them are non-Greek speakers. So whether they want translations into Georgian or Syriac or other Aramaic, these translations are made. Very, very often they're to do with the liturgical life of the monks, their Bible readings, their Psalms, their Book of Hours. It seems that the monks would use their own languages for the daily prayers, but when they meet for the Eucharist, they would be concentrating on Greek, and they would be using Greek, the primary language in this context. Anyway, Samir Halil has shown that Nemesius also is one of the authors that they would study in their monastic formation. And he's found fragments of Nemesius's book translated into Arabic, and it's very distinctive old manuscripts in a special kind of Kufic script. So this is the first context. However, what I want to emphasize is that we're not talking about something really central to the Arab civilization and Arabic Islamic life. Really, when we talk about the 8th century, the 9th century, also even the 10th century, if you are anyone who's anything is going to be in Baghdad. And Baghdad becomes the focus. So very soon we need to turn our thoughts to this legendary place, this city of the world's desire, Baghdad of the caliphs at the height of its influence. I'm showing pictures not of Baghdad, of course. These are pictures of Samarra. And that's because not much remains in terms of early, well, almost, I think as far as I know, no early Abbasid buildings remain in Baghdad. But you can find them not far away in the alternative capital, Samarra. So if we want to get an idea of what Baghdad looked like in the Golden Age, these kind of buildings give us a pretty good idea. This is the Caliphal Palace, and this is the main mosque. And so let's turn to what kind of literature was being produced in Baghdad. And it could be said that On the Nature of Man, our book by Nemesius, didn't remain on the peripheries of Arabic-speaking society. We will find it in Baghdad. Without exaggeration, we can say that this city was the crucible in which, over a period of the next 2 centuries, Islam as we know it was forged. It's the city founded by the Abbasid Caliph Abu Ja'far al-Mansur in 763 AD. And it's really based, its state polity is based on a very different approach than that of the Umayyads. It's based on a multinational empire, and what is drawing people together is Islam. So there is a great deal of pressure to have a religious settlement. The correct kind of Islam is going to be patronized and sponsored from the caliphal court. And caliphal patronage was extremely important. On the one hand, we have the accumulation of hadith literature, which fixes, as it were, how to interpret the Quran, what the Quran is going to mean in terms of society. And we have the codification of the hadiths. We have the class of muhaddithun, the hadith transmitters. But on the other hand, there was a risk to the central power and a risk to the palace that their laws and their policies would be restricted by the emerging Sharia. So what we find is the Abbasid caliphs heavily patronized one kind of kalam, in other words, rational theology, debate, and the use of opinion, and particularly, as is well known, some of them sought to impose Mu'tazili kalam. And there was something called the mihna, which is essentially an inquisition. And so that if you've got a public position, if you're a qadi, if you're an administrator, you've got to sign up to Mu'tazili kalam. This is very much the environment in which literary production is taking place in Baghdad. And we do find Christian writers from this period. There was some hesitation, as I mentioned. They didn't plunge into writing Arabic for 2 centuries, essentially. But at the beginning of the 9th century, we do find the first generation of Christian writers who lay the foundation of what becomes a distinctive Christian Arabic literature. We have names of the writers. The main ones, we know very little about their lives, but one is called Ammar al-Basri, so he's presumably from Basra. There's another one called Abu Ra'it al-Takriti, who's presumably from Takrit, let's say to the north of Baghdad. And there is also Theodorus Abu Qurra. So these are really representatives of the 3 main Christian traditions. And certainly in the case of Abu Raita and Ammar al-Basri, very interestingly, they're using the phraseology, the modes of thought of Muslim kalam. And if you look at a book like Ammar al-Basri's Kitab al-Burhan, the Book of Proof, this has been described as Christian kalam by people like Sidney Griffiths, who points out the same modes of argument, the if clauses lined up. And that's just one example of this style that we find, but many of the same terms as well that you can use that were developed in kalam. It's not surprising to find that kalam has a great deal of apologetics and polemics, and really it's taking its cue from the Quran, which itself contains, enshrines a lot of apologetic and polemical material. By far the largest number of original productions of Christian Arabic literature are apologetic in nature, apologias for Christianity. And this leads scholars of Christian Arabic literature to write about something that's called an apologetic necessity. So the Christians writing in this context are very often defending their faith in the public square. They tend to know Islam and the Quran very well, and this leads us to speculate perhaps they've even been educated in madrasas, equivalent schools, and because that was the way in which to acquire excellence in the language and in the forms of religious expression. So we get a great deal of apologetical literature. One gets a bit tired of, perhaps, at least in my case, hypostases, Christian hypostases, as it were, being equated with Sifat, the attributes of God. We do not find Nemesius in this context. We don't find on the nature of man, and one can, and really the book on the nature of man doesn't lend itself to the Kalam context. Nemesius really is not very dogmatic at all. His main mode of thought is doxography. He's very good at listing other people's opinions. Sometimes he forgets to put in his own arguments as well. And there's a great deal of emphasis on the value of freedom and diversity of thought in Nemesius, not really suited to the Kalam mode. However, there is not just Kalam in Baghdad. The enormous caliphal patronage is also directed towards other areas of the humanities, and particularly philosophy, and it's also directed towards science. And we find that the Abbasid court made enormous efforts to bring the knowledge of Greek science into Arabic. Initially, as Dimitri Goutas and others have pointed out, this was associated with their close connections with Persian culture, and their first inclination was to translate from Pahlavi Persian. The famous first translator was Rusbih Buridadoy, that's to say, in Arabic, Abdullah ibn Muqaffa, from the mid-8th century. He's the best known of the translators of that very early period. Generally, we don't know very much about those translators. And there is also the idea put about that translation from Greek is in fact not reliance upon another culture, but that in fact Alexander the Great stole the wisdom of the East, and all it is bringing that knowledge back home. You know, I've mentioned Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the caliph who instituted these radical changes. To quote from the historian al-Mas'udi, he was the first caliph to have books translated from foreign languages into Arabic, among them Kalila wa Dimna and Sindh Hind. There were also translated for him books by Aristotle on logic and other subjects, the Almagest by Ptolemy, the Arithmetic of Nicomachus of Gerasa, and the book by Euclid, famous elements of geography, of geometry, and other ancient books translated from classical Greek, Pahlavi, Neo-Persian, Syriac. These translated books were published among the people who examined them and devoted themselves to knowing them. So books on, as Masudi mentions, astrology, that's important for the Abbasids to establish themselves as divinely ordained, but also useful for knowing about births, deaths, when to fight battles, and so forth. Translations were also primarily and initially in the practical fields of geometry, measuring one's empire, statecraft, arithmetic, astronomy for travel and telling the time. These subjects were useful to civil servants who formed the large administration in Baghdad. There were also court translations of medical works, and just how much that patronage was worth is clear from a book by Ibn Abi Usaybiyah, that's to say, the Tabaqat al-Attiba, in which he reproduces, he just copies out the account books of Harun al-Rashid when it comes to giving money to his court physician, Bohtishor. There's enormous amounts of money, and Bohtishor is able to buy up great lands in southern Iraq, the Sawad. I also want to mention the first appearance of Nemesius in Baghdad. So our book, the book that we're following, the story of this book that we're telling, it is mentioned by the famous Patriarch or Catholicos Timothy I, the Nestorian Patriarch, a very key figure really in the history of that church in particular. A study in French says that Timothy was profoundly convinced that the one way to maintain one's status and to be accepted by the Muslim rulers was to focus attention on the cultural and moral level of the faithful above all the clergy. His personal prestige at the Abbasid court, he moved his caliphal cathedral, not caliphal cathedral, but his patriarchal cathedral from Ctesiphon to Baghdad. And that was to be in touch with the Abbasid court. And that prestige relied on his knowledge of Greek authors and astronomy. So we have some works from Timothy I, notably a book of laws. He was a great administrator, but he also left a number of letters. And in one of these letters, letter number 43 to Petion, he asks Petion, who was teacher, to look for a book of a philosopher named Nemesius on the constitution of man. And that book begins, man is very well constituted of the soul, which is perceived by the mind, and of the body. So he is bringing into Baghdad the book in Syriac, and all his writings are in Syriac. So that's the first appearance of Nemesius in Baghdad. However, as is well known, there is this enormous patronage of philosophy as well as of rationalist theology. And the first philosopher to mention is Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Kindi. And he was about 32 when al-Ma'mun, major patron of Greek science and thought, died and was replaced by his brother, the Caliph al-Mu'tasim. Many of al-Kindi's works are dedicated to Ahmed, the son of al-Mu'tasim, and al-Kindi was appointed tutor of Ahmed. It's important to remember that al-Kindi, who has a great number of books attributed to him, should be seen as really a circle of writers, what Endres has called the circle of al-Kindi. And it's clear that these writings are centered really, or have a motivation from the religious context. Scholars have argued that al-Kindi's response to the very hot debates of Kalam was to say science, knowledge, also knowledge of God, is basically to be found if one puts everything onto a mathematical basis. So rather like the Neoplatonists, with some flavor also of Pythagoras, geometry is the rebirth of philosophy in Arabic with al-Kindi. That's the title of a work by Gutas. And so he's finding a solution to all the religious debate. He's kind of, let's say, Oliver Cromwell of the religious scene of his time. In God's name, be silent and concentrate on the correct way to understand the truths of God. So many of the works of al-Kindi are about Tawheed, about the essential oneness of God. And it's that religious context which helps us to explain al-Kindi. Al-Kindi has a voracious appetite for assimilating Greek knowledge. He wants to bring it into Arabic. He doesn't do regular translations. They're very often epitomes, glosses. One scholar believes that she's found a quotation from Nemesius in al-Kindi's Book of Definitions. I haven't yet checked that. But where we really do find Nemesius in the philosophical context is the school of translators who you could say were rival translators, somewhat later, but largely contemporary with the Kindi circle. And that's to say the translators associated with Hunayn ibn Ishaq. The most famous one is Hunayn ibn Ishaq. And we know a lot about this group of translators because they've described their work in the famous Risala of Hunayn. Al-Kindi was working with a largely anonymous circle. We do know the name of some of the translators, Ibn al-Batrik. These are Christians. Christians by far the majority of the translators. Ustad, so Eustathius, and Abu Na'ima al-Himsi, These are translators working with Al-Kindi, but largely they're anonymous. We do know the names, and we know a lot about the Hunayn business. He turned translation into a very profitable business. And as I've said, the patronage of the caliph is the way to make money. This was a kind of freelance model of the Hunayn group, and it meant that they also found continuators, and it was a much more enduring model. For 3 or 4 generations after Hunayn, there are also Christian translators in Baghdad. Interesting for us is that they also wrote Christian works. They wrote religious apologetics. You could say that by far the majority of their production is philosophical or scientific, and that was really where the heart of their work lies. However, there was this apologetic necessity. They did have to justify themselves in the public square. So you do find these works of highly trained, brilliant philosophers. They had to know the philosophy before they could translate it clearly, but they also write their own philosophical and scientific works. This is kind of Thomas Aquinas avant la lettre. These are people who use Aristotelian terms and Aristotelian logic to justify their Christian beliefs. I would say that perhaps a certain amount of Hunayn's apologetics survive. Very interesting, his correspondence with Ibn al-Munajjim, the reply from Costa bin Luca, but also his justification of finding the true religion, and also Ishaq. We don't find apologetics from Ishaq, but I very much imagine that Ishaq bin Hunayn, his son, wrote Christian apologetics, and this is really, in some ways, the most interesting writings from the Christian Arabs that I've come across anyway. And Georg Graf, the great scholar on Christian Arabic, describes one of these writers, Yahya ibn Adi, a translator and a philosopher, as ein Stern erster Großer, so a very important star among the writers of the Christian Arabic literature, writing also apologetics, Christian apologetics. And this is the context in which we find Nemesis really appearing and becoming well known in Arabic translation, because Ishaq ibn Hunayn produced a full translation of Nemesis. It's true to say that they tend to write in translation ease, but that's not really necessarily pejorative. It's a highly refined style cultivated by those influenced by Greek literature. And it's grammatically and stylistically brilliant in its own way, and it's a very flexible language.
Forgive me for interrupting. Oh, yes, the slide is moving on. Yes, fine. Thank you.
Yeah. So here we go. Yes, I should have moved to this slide earlier, but thanks for reminding me. This is Aristotle speaking presumably to the writer of the book, who is Bortichot. Well, it's quite a famous miniature. This is perhaps the most famous manuscript from the Hunayn school, and it's a complete organon of Aristotle, so all of Aristotle's logical works, and that's called the Paris Organon. What we see here is a page from the Topics, and that is translated by someone called Abu Uthman al-Dimashqi. Here is the translation of Nemesius. So four manuscripts survive of Ishaq bin Hunayn's complete translation. 3 of them were preserved by Christians in churches and monasteries, but this one is the copy that came down through Muslim libraries, and it's quite interesting. It's now in Damascus. The collection used to be called Zahiriya, but it's now in the National what was called the Assad Library. I'm sure it's not called that now. Anyway, it remained in Baghdad until the 16th century. It was bought and used and read. We can see this from the reader's marks and from the other notes. Then it was sold. We find it going to Istanbul and then Damascus. It really had quite a journey. In the 19th century, it was found in the Royal Library of Mirza Muhammad Kayhardar Shukr, who was a grandson of the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah. And finally, it returned via Mashhad to Damascus, where it is now. So whether it was particularly Nemesius or one of it's a majmur, so there are many works, generally philosophical, in this book. Something for me to follow up, really. So here's something rather surprising. As you often find with great scientific revolutions, like the scientific movement within Islam, like the Renaissance, like the so-called Renaissance of the late Middle Ages as well, alongside the rationalist scientific works, there is a great deal of interest in occult sciences. And so we're talking about astrology, alchemy, magic of various kinds. And interestingly enough, this is also a context where Nemesius's book was used and had quite a central place. And someone called Paul Krauss, great scholar, has studied the main alchemical production of the Arabs of the possibly late 8th, but certainly 9th century, 10th century, in his book on Jabir ibn Hayyan. And in his second volume, which we can call the Science Grecque, we find a central importance given to a base text used by the Jabarian. Again, it's not just one person, it's a circle. The Jabarian alchemists, central importance given to a book called Sir al-Khalika, so the secret of creation. And this book is in 2 recensions. The long recension has an epitome, a long epitome of On the Nature of Man. This is likely to be an earlier translation. Either it was an epitome from the outset, or it's an epitome of an earlier translation, perhaps from the time of Al-Ma'mun, and it's not Ishaq's translation. Really, the alchemists were from a different class from those patronized by the caliphal court. They tended to be in commerce or in the markets. They were secretive. They used the name Jabir rather than their own names. They were Shi'i, there's no doubt about that, but whether Krauss is right in saying that they were also Harmati Ismailis, that's more questionable. So this is a very interesting and unusual, unexpected appearance of our bishop of Emesa in Arabic literature. And clearly he's playing a central role in the alchemical world. One shouldn't underestimate how much alchemical production there was and is until recently in Arabic. I mean, one whole volume, one whole chapter of Ibn Nadim's catalogue of books available in Baghdad in the 10th century is dedicated to alchemical titles. So now we're moving outside Baghdad. We're really talking about the aftermath of all this production, literary production, and where is Nemesius to be found? Where have I found him? Where have other people, well, mainly other people found him? Charles Burnet, great scholar of Arabic into Latin, has found in Salerno. This is a medical garden in Salerno. There was a famous medical school. The first works translated from Arabic into Latin were translated, medical works translated in Salerno in Italy, near Naples. And among them, Charles Burnett has found a Latin translation of the 5th chapter of Nemesius's On the Nature of Man. So we can conclude from that really that Nemesius's work was also used in medical circles by physicians. There was a medical center in Kairouan, and it seems that many of the works, many of the texts that were then translated into Latin came initially from Kairouan, just across the Mediterranean. And this is the Sidi Okba Mosque in Kairouan, in Tunisia. Yeah. Another chapter in the story of Nemesius is what happened in Antioch, Antakya. And you will have noticed that in this story, there's a rather recurring topic, which is the constraints that Arab Christian writers were under and Arab Christians lived under through the centuries. What happens when the political realities change? And they did in Antioch, because the emperor Nikephoros Phocas, who died in 969, retook the city of Antioch. And this was, of course, one of the 5 most important cities in Orthodox Christianity. Byzantines had a great deal of interest in fortifying Antioch and retaining Antioch at that time. What we find is rather a reawakening of literary interest and cultural life in Antioch, in now Byzantine Antioch, but most of the people there are Arabic speakers. So the main author, well known, is Abdullah ibn al-Fadl. He's the leading light. He writes a book, Kitab al-Rawda, and this has word for word a number of chapters from Ishaq's translation of Nemesius. And Nemesius is back in fashion. Of course, we can ask what was the motivations behind this literary flourishing in Antioch, in now Byzantine Antioch, amongst the Arab Christians. You could call it perhaps a Nahda before the Nahda. The Nahda refers to kind of revival in cultural life, usually associated with the 19th century. But some scholars suggest, no doubt with good reason, that there was a need to strengthen Christian Arabic education of priests and deacons. Otherwise, Constantinople would send their men and they would fill all the posts, and they would insist on the Greek Constantinopolitan forms replacing the local liturgical practices and so on. So there was no doubt a certain amount of rivalry also, which led to the need for this cultural revival amongst the Arab Christians. So that's really where I'm leaving things. This is the Byzantine general taking Antioch, and this is a Greek church in modern Antioch, Antakya. So a final puzzle is that Alexander Trieger has found a quotation from Nemesius in Persian by the Ismaili author and traveler Nasir al-Khosrav. And he writes that this is a different translation from any of the translations known so far. So that's a question to be followed up, and I haven't done that yet. So I've been trying to tell a story. I've been trying to tell the story from the perspective of Christian Arab authors themselves. And what do I hope has been achieved by this talk? Really, I want to place in the context of Muslim-Christian relations the experience of the Christian Arabs. And I think it's worth it to take time and to become familiar with their literature. I think it's also very useful from the point of view of Christianity. I'm unashamedly, everyone has a bias, we may as well be open about it. I'm unashamedly giving this story from a Christian perspective. I think that Islam can be very challenging and can lead us to a deeper commitment. These are some faith-based conclusions related to what I've been talking about. I think also that the importance of Christian communities and the church, in some ways, the traditional church, the traditions of those churches are able to strengthen and lead to survival. So a vision of a Eucharistic community rather than individual Christians and individual conversions is what emerges for me, and it has been important for me in my thinking about these issues. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, Christian Arabic literature in this very different context under Islam is it's reliably unexpected. It's reliably producing surprises, whether it's alchemy or whether it's a revival of Chalcedonian Christianity. It takes a certain amount of time to understand why these unexpected results come about. It demands an open mind. It's a kind of mental gymnastics brought to bear upon the history of very different kinds of expressions of Christianity. So that's really, those are the conclusions that I draw from my reading of Christian Arabic literature, and in particular these translations. So I'm going to leave it there.